Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for the second day of the 1940s in Focus American Art During the Decade of Transition conference. This afternoon, we will have three panels. The first one will start in a few minutes, followed immediately by another one that will start at 3:15. We'll have a short break between 4:15 and 4:30 when we start our last panel for the day. And then at 5:10 British Standard Time, we will have our second plenary address by Professor Alexandra Namarov. I'm grateful to all the presenters, to the Center for American Art at the Carroll, and to the team at the Research Forum for their invaluable support throughout this event. I'm grateful to the audience for joining us, and I just want to let you know that throughout the presentations, you will not be able to turn on your camera or microphone, but we ask you and welcome you to submit your questions and comments via the chat function on the bottom of your screen. And we're really looking forward to the discussion. So without further ado, I will pass it on to John Fagg, who will introduce our speakers for the first panel.
Thanks so much, Tatiana. That's great. So this is the first panel of the day, titled Alternative Genealogies. Our first speaker today is Jonathan Black, who is Senior Research Fellow in History of Art at Kingston School of Art, Kingston University, London. He's published widely, primarily on British art and artists of the first half of the 20th century, often focusing on the First and Second World Wars. Those publications run from Edward Wadsworth, The Complete Paintings and Drawings, 2006, to more recent publications, and three recent texts are War in the Sunshine, The British in Italy, 1917-18, Winston Churchill in British Art, 1900 to the present day, and Alfred Munning's Memory, the War Horse, and the Canadians in 1918. We're really pleased to have Jonathan with us today to give the talk From Precisionist Modernity to Romantic Primitive and the Deceptive Rural Idyll, George C. Alt and 1940s America. Thank you, Jonathan.
So I'm talking about George Cleveland, or Alt. Well, he actually started off as George Christian Alt. He was born in Cleveland in 1891, and he came to prominence in the late 1920s in Greenwich Village as a, well, later became known as a precisionist, or the Precision School of Painting. He exhibited in 1927 in the Machine Age exposition that Louis Loswick had helped put together in the late 1920s. And his exhibition catalogue essay, Loswick refers to the sort of the need for greater precision in the art of that would tackle the sites of today, of the industrial age. And Alt is of interest, or has quite an interesting background, in that he was actually he was born in Cleveland. He moved at the age of 1.5 to London to Haverstock Hill, as his father was the London representative of the local family firm which manufactured printing ink. This was Viborg and Alt, and the father and the family lived in NW3 from about 1891, from 1891 to 1911. During the period from 1908 to 1911, Alt he exhibited, well, he was studied at the St John's Wood School of Art, and then moved to the Slade. And at St John's Wood and then at the Slade, he was friendly with artists such as future vorticists such as Edward Wadsworth, and with the futurist Nevinson, Christopher Nevinson. In 1911, the family moved back to America, back to New Jersey, where the father was placed in charge of the main family factory that produced ink, which was in New Jersey, and he had a bit of training in New Jersey and also in New York, but he had quite a sort of privileged and well-heeled lifestyle, since he was able to work without actually having any sort of formal job until he was in his early 40s. He said it was rather like something out of the Magnificent Ambersons or Manhattan Transfer, in that its father died from cancer in 1929, and then suddenly much of the family's money was lost in the Wall Street crash of October of that same year. And then the family lawyer ran off with a lot of the money. That was the remaining money. And there was a little left, which George lived on until it sort of ran out completely by the mid-1930s, whereupon he found a position with the Works Administration, Federal Art Project, part of the WPA. But just to give you an idea of some of the work he was producing in the late 1920s during his sort of precisionist phase, when he was friendly with artists such as Lozowick and Georgia O'Keeffe and Stuart Davis and Abraham Valkowitz. And also he also crossed paths with Charles's Sheila and Demuth. To give an idea what he was painting up until sort of early mid-30s. And then in 1935, he got married to a woman called Louise Jonas from a sort of Czech peasant background, and began to sort of politically move to the left. In fact, joined the Communist Party of the United States in 1935. And he was a member until 1939, when, well, it's not quite sure whether he was expelled, asked to leave, to let his membership lapse. It was one of those sort of combination of those three. And in the autumn of 1937, he moved with his wife Louise to upstate New York, to the little town of Woodstock, which had about a population of about 5,500 people when he moved there in September 1937. And he began painting work that is sort of celebrating the vernacular architecture of the area, domestic and ecclesiastical. Here's a sort of Methodist church in the traditional style of the area from the late 30s, from 38, and also began to semi-surreal facades, again inspired by the vernacular architecture of the local area of Woodstock, where he was living at the time with Louise in a sort of rather dilapidated sort of former barn. He turned into a studio and a home to live in, which he rented for $10 a month, and which had no running water, no electricity. And the lighting was provided by a kerosene lamp, and heating by a sort of wood burning stove. So he lived a sort of pretty sort of harsh, demanding sort of life, rather sort of bare bones, really restrained and peeled back. He was also painting work for there was a sort of lively local art scene. Woodstock had an artist colony, at least from the late 1880s of one sort or another, into the early 1930s. It was a sort of favourite place to visit by students from the New York Art Students League. And in one of the little galleries, called the Little Gallery in Woodstock, he began to exhibit these sort of very, well, decorative but rather bleak evocations of the winter landscape of the area of the Catskills. Also began exhibiting these barns inspired by a barn owned by a neighbour, Rick's barn. This is the Rick barn from 1940, again, often in sort of wintry, snowbound settings. And the barns do look quite sort of rough, weather-beaten and dilapidated when you compare them to slightly earlier works, also celebrating vernacular architecture of the United States, rural United States, by Charles Sheeler, who altered sort of cross paths with back in the 1920s in Greenwich Village. And he continued to create a series of works in oils and gouache, celebrating these sort of local barns and farm buildings. Also sort of began to look at them at night, so started to produce sort of nocturnal images of these barns and rural structures. And then from looking at barns, he then moved to this particular, he painted half a dozen works inspired by this area just to the sort of northwest of where he lived in Woodstock, Russell Corners Crossroads. This is the first of the series, which was exhibited in the Little Gallery in Woodstock in July 1943. It was sort of very striking at how, again, the imagery is restrained and pared back, and he said he didn't write much about his work, but he is quoted at the time as in a local newspaper saying about how he needed to boil down everything to the absolute essential of a composition. And that while he wasn't interested in mysticism, it was the mystery that counted. And I think you've got that sort of sense here, anticipating it's an exact contemporary parallel with the sort of cinematography of the film noir films that he so much enjoyed watching in the cinema not in Woodstock, because they didn't have a cinema, but in Kingston, not far from Woodstock. He would go at least 2 or 3 times a week to see films there with his wife, who worked part-time at the newspaper in Kingston. And it has that sort of film noir menace of you wonder what's about to happen. There's a still from a scene where there's a murder or an ambush, kidnapping is sort of being planned. And it's worth noting as well with the prominence of the light, the electric light, as the electrification had come fairly late to that area. It was a consequence of the New Deal in the late 1930s. It's ironic to note that the house or the building on the right, the white building, was in the process of being transformed into a series of artist studios, and that the area had already become attractive to visiting art, especially at summertime. And just to note that one of the few of his artists' friends he kept in touch with from his Greenwich Village days was Georgia O'Keeffe, and though she painted nocturnal locations of New York back in the late 1920s, which have a very different feel to them, to the sort of starker, more restrained version that Alt created. Then he painted the corners in daylight, and they seem even sort of bleaker, but daylight and under snow in 1944, by which time, of course, the war was well and truly unfolding around them, and there's no reference at all in his work at the time of the war, but he was very much conscious of the fact that he was 4F and unable to participate. But he did sort of keep an eye on the local newspaper to people from the area as to whether they had been participating in the war and if they had come to any harm. He also sort of painted the occasional sort of more, decorative, anecdotal work. This is inspired by a sort of local, semi-mythical pioneer character from the 18th century called Festus Yapel, who took his oxen and down the area, up and down the valley in the 19th century, late 18th century. and the sort of scene that appealed to a little band of devoted supporters, patrons, purchasers who liked alt work. And by the mid to late 1940s, and he was able to sell these works for quite a sort of respectable price, I think between $150 to $200 per canvas. And then in the late 40s, he returned to Russell's Corners again with 2 or 3 more works focusing on the area illuminated at night by electric light, which of course by 1946, sort of prominent light inevitably thought about the recent atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, and the sort of sinister side to technology, as well as more sort of connection with the imagery of the cinematography of film noir that was sort of coming popular. It's not surprising that one of his favourite films at the time was the Maltese Falcon from 1941, and he enjoyed sort of reading murder mysteries by Nero Wolfe and Raymond Chandler. And just to show one of the, occasionally he would paint sort of nocturnal scenes of Woodstock, often with a sort of empty particular cafe he patronised. He enjoyed rambling around, walking around Woodstock at night, often to visit, to go up to Russell Corner Crossroads. And we have to show that he wasn't alone in this sort of interest in the imagery of the nighttime and of the cafes. This is Edward Hopper, of course, the inimitable Nighthawks of 1942. And the last work I want to talk about, which is one of the last works he painted before he died, which is August Night at Russell's Corners, which was painted in August 1948. Where by this point in time, his wife later recalled, he was becoming rather sort of paranoid. Ironically, given that he was beginning to sell work, he was worrying about that the government was wanting to take away his money, and at the same time, he was concerned that because of his left-wing past, that if Truman lost the forthcoming election in 1948, he feared the Republicans would start putting people into camps such as himself. So he tragically, only 3 months after he painted this work, fell into the local river during one of his nighttime rambles, possibly well-oiled by lethal homemade martinis that he liked to drink, and drowned in December 1948. So that was the unfortunate end of George Alt. So thank you very much.
So Maya Deren, Images, Future, Past. I want to start my talk this afternoon with an image I encountered 2 summers ago in the archive of the Czech-American photographer Alexander Hammond. The image is of the face of the artist Maya Deren, compressed and framed by a violent halo of water, a still image that was taken from the opening sequence of Deren's third film, At Land, from 1944, a film where Deren's character emerges on the shore of Amagansett, Long Island, in reverse motion. When I encountered this image in Hammond's archive 2 summers ago, it was coupled with another photograph from his archive, a half-profile photograph of Deren, turned away from the camera's lens, facing the waves of Amagansett. I was drawn to this photograph for its obstinate negativity, its refusal to stare back at the camera, to return the camera's gaze, to implicitly stare back at us, the viewer. It was unlike anything I had seen before in either Deren or Hammond's archive. Nothing like the images of arresting immediacy associated with Deren and Hammond's work. 4 years ago, I'd come across a passing reference Deren made to her friend, the anthropologist Herbert Passon, of a one-person exhibition of photographs her husband and close collaborator, Alexander Hammond, staged at the Pasadena Art Institute on January 15th, 1943. exhibition that took place 5 months before the couple shot their experimental film, Meshes of the Afternoon. When I contacted the Norton Salmon Museum a few years back, the museum's director and current caretaker of the Pasadena Art Institute's archives notified me that they had no record of the exhibition. They did, however, suggest that I contact Alexander Hamid's son, Tino Hamid, who she believed still lived in Los Angeles. The director of the museum informed me that a number of years ago, Tino Hamid had tried to sell his father's archive to the museum, and for whatever reason, the museum had rejected the son's offer. Since Darren's passing in 1961, extensive research has been done on her life and work. I was under the impression that the majority of photographs, films, and other material were located in Darren's archive at Boston University, but I was sure there were other photographs that had perhaps never seen the light of day. 2 summers ago, I finally made contact with the Hamid archive through a circuitous route that take me from Los Angeles to Boston to New Jersey. The full story of this discovery is not for this afternoon's talk, but I make reference to it as a nod to how the photographs I encountered along the way have opened up Darren's work in unexpected and unforeseen ways. First glance and upon extended viewing, I've been continually drawn to this work for its extraordinary range and scope. Type of work premised on the disorienting staging of the subject to a range of photographic techniques, whether through a perspective of worm's eye view or bird's eye view, or mirrored perspective. Darren and Hamid's photographs oscillate between sensual visions of intimacy with unnerving glances of the figure, couple, or group displaced and transfigured throughout the interiors, streets, and landscapes of 1940s Los Angeles, a space of exile and intimacy, homelessness and displacement, which both Darren and Hamid had experienced quite acutely alongside their European counterparts who were forced to flee the violence of German fascism. What Darren encounters through the medium of photography in this period is a multiplication, a displacement, a becoming other, or what she identifies as the unreal real, a pervasive strangeness, to quote Rudolf Arnheim, her own self becoming a character, becoming strange, depersonalized. This unreal real of the image is especially true of a series of photographs of Darren and Hamid's close friend, Galka Shire, collector and dealer of the works of Paul Klee, Vasily Kandinsky, and other members of the European avant-garde, whose collection is now stored in the Norton Salmon Museum. For Darren and Hamid, Los Angeles in the early 1940s made for an unstable home, at once idyllic and alienating, Mediterranean but also desert, a landscape open to aesthetic possibilities, but also 3,000 miles away from the center of culture in New York City, a city Darren and Hamid would eventually move to after completing Meshes of the Afternoon in May 1943. With the amplification of the war effort, Hamid was hired as a director for the Office of War Information in New York City, where he worked on a short documentary on the Library of Congress and a profile of the Italian conductor, Arturo Toscanini, for the 1944 film, The Hymn of the Nations. In contrast to her husband, Darren had committed to working independently, outside of the studio system, seeking to explore, in her words, film's infinite formal and political possibilities to create in her films from the period At Land to Ritual to In Transfigured Time, new technologically mediated experiences of time and space through a sharpened and advanced filmic vocabulary. Darren's 1944 film, At Land, was envisioned as a contemporary epic somewhat similar to Homer's Odyssey. But unlike Odysseus, who's cast adrift at sea, Darren's character is lost on land and is neither bound by a stable conception of time, space, nor narrative structure. To put it simply, the landscape upon which her character travels is disparate and disconnected, comprising the sand dunes of Amagansett, a dining hall in the Great Northern Hotel, an interior of a room which houses a dying man, and a beach at Port Jefferson, where a game of chess is being played by 2 women. Now, the ambition of this film, Darren wrote in 1945, was to eliminate, as far as possible, any literary dramatic line in literal symbolic meanings, and to involve instead a purely cinematic coherence and integrity. That was a quote from Darren. And this coherence and integrity was realized, however, paradoxically, through the camera's displaced movements and irrational transitions, forms that were channeled to suspend the logic of the world and vex the stability of filmic time and space. In the final sequence of the film, each separate scene, beach, interior, dune, and shore, is shown in rapid succession to suggest that each moment was occurring simultaneously in what seems like an interminable but multiplied present. And before this final scene, when Darren's character runs along the length of the beach in Port Jefferson, she raises her head and appears to look at her multiplied selves gathering stones, standing on a cliff's edge, climbing amongst the crowd in a banquet hall. And in each passing scene, her head rises and turns around, almost as if the image itself was turning around, suggesting that her present self was watching her past and future self in an infinitely split and forked moment. 2 summers ago, I traveled to Amagansett to encounter firsthand the infinite stretch of beach where Darren emerged from the Atlantic in reverse motion. The excursion was part of a larger research trip that took me to Darren's archive in Boston University, Hamid's family archive in New Jersey, and Darren and Hamid's top floor apartment at 61 Morton Street in Greenwich Village. If you walk the beaches of Amagansett today, you will find no trace of Darren's footsteps, no historical plaque declaring her previous presence, no ledger that tells the story of Darren's encounter on the beach and shore in 1944. In fact, the same stretch of beach is memorialized today through a different story. A local memorial erected on the shores of the beach recalls invasion by U-boat of 4 members of the German military on June 13, 1942, and events that led to the eventual capture. The building that stands on its shores today is dedicated to the entire shambolic operation. The arrival on the beach by rubber boats, the encounter with the local guardsmen, the burying of explosives in the Amagansett dunes, their evasion by the local authorities, but also the eventual capture and execution by military trial on August 8, 1942. But on that day, when I encountered the memorial to that fateful invasion, a different image was on my mind. The photograph that I had uncovered in Hamid's archive a few days before. And in Hamid's image, Darren is pictured at the edge of the shore, and her hair is soaking wet, and she is without clothes. And in the middle distance, the waves of the Atlantic are visible as an imperceptible mass. These are the same waves, one could presume, from which Darren had emerged just moments before. And in the image, Darren turns away from Hamid's camera, refusing the immediacy of her face, while the camera focuses its attention to the wave-like undulations of Darren's hair. Now, photographing the back refuses the face and confronts instead the peculiar enigma that dwells in the obscurity of the back. And Darren's refusal, I would argue, counters what we could call the overexposed image, the too present, too revealed, over-advertised face. And without a face to ground the viewer's gaze, a blind spot persists in our field of vision. There are other reproductions in Hamid's archive of Darren posed on the shore of Amagansett, but no other photographs from that day contain the same power or unnerving presence of the still reproduced from that land. It was this image of refusal and negativity that Hamid decided to print. And walking the sand dunes of Amagansett, a question still puzzled me. What did this image of refusal hold for the writing of history? 2 of the great film critics of the 1940s, James Agee and Andy Farber, both reviewed At Land and both were critical of the film and Darren's work on the whole. Agee's pithy article for The Nation called Darren's work derivative, whereas Farber's review in the New Republic was far more vicious, if not homophobic, characterizing Darren's work with an almost unending list of invectives, to quote Farber, Freudian-toned, lesbianish, freezing, arty, eclectic, conventional, and safe. And actually, Farber's review gets far worse in this article in the New Republic. But when reading other accounts of At Land, I was instead attracted to, but also puzzled by, a description by one of Darren's collaborators, the writer and diarist Annice Nin. Before Nin and Darren had become collaborators in Darren's 1946 film, Ritual and Transfigured Time, Nin had first encountered Darren and Hamid by chance on the beaches of Amagansett while they filmed the opening sequence to At Land. A few years later, Darren would cast Nin in Ritual and Transfigured Time, a film Nin subsequently abhorred, taking offense to what she saw as Darren's unintentional, but nevertheless unflattering depiction. In a diary entry penned in early August 1945, Nin writes of walking along the infinite stretch of beach in Amagansett and watching from afar a woman who she did not know at the time, repeatedly being tossed by waves toward the shore. She recalls how the same body would stand up and soon run into the waves and begin again. And at the time, Nin was perplexed by the sight, but despite her confusion, no words were exchanged between them, Darren, Hamid, nor Darren's camerawoman, Hella Hyman. A year later, when Darren and Nin had officially met at the couple's apartment on 61 Morton Street in Greenwich Village, during a screening of that land, Nin had recognized the image of Darren immediately. What is peculiar, however, is how Nin framed this encounter with Darren in her diary. It followed immediately after Nin's entry on the bombing of Hiroshima. She writes, "A horror to stun the world, unbelievable barbarism." But Nin also bookends her passage of meeting Darren with another catastrophe. Second bomb dropped on Nagasaki. This is savagery on such scale, I cannot believe it. But what is striking about this account are the dates of Nin's diary. The entry was penned in early August 1945, and yet Darren had filmed at land in the summer of 1944. And according to Darren's ledger, Hammond and Darren first entertained Nin in early July 1945, a month before the United States government dropped their first bomb on Hiroshima, August 6th, and the second on Nagasaki, August 9th. In this complex weave of dates and encounters, a question rears its head. Why bookmark a personal encounter between these two dates, August 6th and August 9th, when Nin had encountered Darren and Hamid a year before, and officially a month before the events took place? I should add here that in her August 1945 entry, Nin is quite clear in her opposition to what we take as history when confronted with the disasters of war. It seems unbelievable, Nin writes in the context of the events of 1945, that we can go on living, loving, working in a world so monstrous. And this is because we do not know how to curb the savagery of war, how to control history. That is why I hate history, because it makes man feel helpless in the stranglehold of hatred. More wars, more destruction. More horrible ways to destroy human beings. What can we do? Because we feel we have no say in all of this, we turn away. Those who talk politics all day and all night have not solved anything. We turn away. Nin's account, I would argue, encourages us to reconsider how images come into being, both in the sense of how they were made, but also how they live in the memories of their viewers through the detours and displacements of memory, memories, falsifications, and fictions, the forgetting and repressing of events. And one way to complicate and provide greater texture to Nin's account is to visit the room where Darren screened her film, her apartment on 61 Morton Street, Greenwich Village. The couple's apartment was a central pivot to Darren's aesthetic activity during the 1940s. I should note here that the couple's first film, Meshes of the Afternoon, was shot almost entirely in the couple's home in Los Angeles, but this was also the case, part or whole, for the majority of Darren's New York films. The photographs of Darren and Hamid's apartment detail a space of wonder and enchantment. The couple had suspended over the mantelpiece a spiral sculpture made out of paper, and underneath the sculpture, Hamid would often place a candle so the sculpture would turn hypnotically when suspended over the candle's flame. Other objects filled the room's periphery. A crinoline dress hanger was affixed atop a lamp to resemble a Christmas tree. A small copy of Marcel Duchamp's Large Glass was hung on the wall, and you can see it just barely in the far right corner there, as well as a series of works by Paul Klee, given to the couple by their friend Galka Shire. The couple had also painted the interior a radiant blue, evidence in a series of rare color photographs of Darren shot by Hamid in the 1940s. To some friends and visitors, her apartment reminded them of an underwater chamber, especially when encountered at night in near darkness during the couple's extended screenings, when the room was briefly illuminated by the faint and flickering light of the projector. But 2 summers ago, when I encountered photographs from Hamid's archive in upstate New Jersey, I was balancing all of these interconnected images in my mind. Photographs from the couple's interior, the obstinate portrait of Darren's back, the immersed image of her face from that land with other negatives from Hamid's archive. But both Darren's archive at Boston University and Hamid's family archive in upstate New Jersey are often, or most of them are assembled in disorganized piles and stacks. Sometimes negatives are labeled, but more often than not, the archive contains unidentified folders and stacks of small contact prints. Stored in the family's living room, for instance, Hamid's photographs are held in cluttered shoeboxes and folders, whereas in Darren's archive, many of her negatives and contact prints are jumbled together without a clear logic or reason. And one of the last folders I encountered on my trip to the Hamid archive was a collection of negatives of all the artworks that Hammett and Darren had owned as a married couple. When Darren and Hammett had left Los Angeles for New York, Galkashire loaned the couple 4 paintings by the Swiss-German artist Paul Klee. The collection included a painting of a cat, a landscape, a wild beast, and an untitled portrait. When I encountered this series this past summer, I asked Julia Hammett, Alexander Hammett's daughter, whether the family was still in possession of these works. And in our brief conversation, she quickly brushed aside the question. All the works were sold at auction when the family had come under financial difficulties in the early 2000s, and the details of the sale were unclear to Julia, who was standing in for her sister-in-law, the current caretaker of the family archive. Going through Hammett's negatives, it was this small clay portrait that caught my eye. I was drawn to the work because I felt as though I had encountered it previously. And near the end of my visit, I found myself distractedly looking around the family's living room, gazing rather lazily at the family's bookshelf. And there, in the room, just sitting there on the shelf, was the exact portrait, unframed, casually displayed like a disposable Christmas card. And holding the watercolor in my hands, I was struck how its presence in the next years of use. The work had aged over time. Its edges were frayed and fragile. The bottom register was slightly torn. In placing the work on the table, my eye was immediately drawn to the curls of the figure's hair, curls that were painted as spirals that flowed both outwards and inwards from the figure's head, spirals that were part of the world as much as the figure. This movement was placed in contrast to the figure's rigid posture, their steely glance, the eye-twitching jaunt of their heads, as if the off-kilter look of their eyes was a way to throw suspicion back at the viewer, almost asking you, what are you looking at? And perhaps I was drawn to this figure for its formal, front-facing resemblance to another work by Klee, the Angelus Novus, or Angel of History from 1921, a work that was once held in the possession, of course, of Walter Benjamin and subject to his 9th thesis, the oft-quoted essay on the concept of history, written in the winter and spring months of 1940. In a way, the look of Darren and Hammett's clay portrait was akin to what Benjamin once called the look of petrified unrest. This look operated as a short circuit in the realm of thought, a Medusa-like effect which held the capacity to suspend the continuity between the past and present, a movement that opposed any final word, a short circuit that opened up the image to a future it does not know it will inaugurate. And perhaps this watercolor was my own angel of history. And perhaps it was only through this vortex of drowned and swirling images, literally a small watercolor encountered by chance on the shelf, or a photograph buried in a stack of papers, where one is able to offer up a different account of history, of experience. And perhaps enclosed within this thought, as a gaze capable of channeling the intensity of life's movements, an encounter that holds the capacity to arise within us a sensation, a feeling, a revelation, a rare internal movement that can nullify or empty out, perhaps, the destructive impulses of culture, holding the capacity to draw us back, spiral-like, to the nerve-framed encounters of which life's movements are formed. After staring at the painting for some time, I asked Julia if she knew the provenance of the work, and I inferred that it was most likely a watercolor by Paul Klee. And to my surprise, she responded rather casually, "Oh, is it? That's it. Thanks."
15 months in the making. Charles Pat Murray's 9 by 6 foot oil painting, Municipal Law Enforcement, was plotted carefully and with police sense in view. The painting is hung inside Kansas City's police headquarters since early January 1950, when the artist, a police officer already 10 years on the force there, donated it, a gift to the department. Here we see police leadership enjoying their new picture. You can see Murray pulling back the curtain. On the right is the building where it lives. Today, it hangs just outside the office of the chief of police in Kansas City. Here we see the painting as it was photographed for me by that department's in-house historian, the very generous and patient Alan Pierce. As can be expected, Murray's work has not lately been accessible to Philadelphia-based art historians with their cameras. Today, as is too often the case, we will see what the police see by way of what images the police will supply to us. As installed at police headquarters, the painting is badly lit. Recent color photographs memorialize the lightless obscurity of the feature I most want to show you today. My requests for more and better photographs were refused on account of a recent reallocation of police funds toward community services and prevention. I can't complain. And anyways, this feature that interests me, a radio tower, is typical of infrastructure in its being structurally decisive, even where it's hardly discernible. An old black and white reproduction offers a better view. In municipal law enforcement, the two-way police radio tower organizes police work. Its communications compose urban space and assign it its representational order. The rise of the headquarters' 135-foot Blaw-Knox police radio antenna establishes the picture's ceiling and proportion, and so the full scope of municipal law enforcement's field of vision. A power technology par excellence, as John Durham Peters has written of the tower as a logistical medium in general, this police radio tower establishes the point about which everything revolves. Its bisecting vertical axis cuts down clean through the new headquarters building that is its operational basis. Dropping the tower's line lets out at the canvas's bottom, running as if right through the optics of a forensic investigator's crime lab microscope. The compositional device is revealed as if disclosed by a polarizing police laboratory lamp. And there at that terminus, we find a locus of the new 1940s modern police science, where police reformers, like those in Kansas City, imagined that the place of the rubber hose and the third degree might be better claimed by the disinterested hand of technology. Light, chemistry, lens, and radio signal converge so that the tutored criminological eye might more fairly get to the bottom of things. And as I go, I'm going to be jumping between different photographic copies of this painting because no one does all the things I need it to do, alas, so please bear with me. Okay, the tower's compositional cleaving of police headquarters, concrete architectural edifice, one side noontime bright and the other dark and electrically lit, might signal police radio's own aspirational role as a technological fix against the deep municipal machine corruption that built it. But its structural effects span Murray's Kansas City. Fulfilling two-way police radio's then novel and much lauded revolutionary promise as the new long arm of the law, that same axial division of the urban scene adjoins night and day, affecting a technical compression of time and space to render the city knowable and navigable and so easily policeable at all hours, day and night, east and west. The headquarters building entrance lets out onto the corner of Locust and West 12th Street, which traverses the city and the picture, easing downhill and then northwest up Locust into the well-lit downtown with its Art Deco interwar skyline. There, friendly motorcycle patrolmen ticket respectable motorists and friendly beat cops mind good kids' innocent fun, their khaki uniforms modeled on military attire. An elderly person awaits their bus in safety. That same viscous road, 12th Street, winds back up and past the criminologically transitional figure of the post-prohibition drunk into a shadowy east side of segregated industrial factories and the predominantly Black and redlined neighborhoods that powered them. Here, where looming smokestacks stand as reminders of wartime aircraft engine production or its desegregationist wildcat strikes, or both, it is in Murray's view always dark, a menacing place where new streetlights barely fend off lawless shadows and where, just beneath the threshold of visibility, a policeman inexplicably fires up and into the East Side Hotel, then a haunt of touring jazz players, booked to play at the nearby Lincoln Theater. And we might note here that jazz musicians, too much at the time, too much in defiance of the color line, were an especially publicized target of police aggression in Kansas City in the 40s, with the likes of Callaway and Ellington caught up in the treachery. Kansas City was, in the words of local Black press editor for the Daily Call and future NAACP head Roy Wilkins, quote, a Jim Crow city right down to its bootstraps. The threat of violence is rendered more legibly by Murray, still at the perimeter here, where 3 police officers stand ready with machine gun, flashlight, and tear gas gun at the threshold of some suggestively dreamlike adobe structure, described by the KC police historian as a, quote, dilapidated apartment building. Opposite the bright and proud beacon of the Liberty Memorial Tower at the picture's far left, with its epitaph to the vanquished foreign foes, these police, whose presence commands the picture's east side, stand ready against new domestic ones, quote, occupying soldiers in a bitterly hostile territory, end quote, as James Baldwin would later put it, of the NYPD's presence in Harlem. If the headquarters clock at picture's center reads lunchtime on the city's west side, on the east side, that same clock reads just after midnight. And accepting the heavy police presence, the streets seem quiet. No surprise, as the crisis reported of the severely segregated KCPD's hot and bloody warfare against Black Kansas City in the early 40s, quote, white officers in squad cars decided that midnight was as long as the habitus of 12th Street could be trusted out of doors, end quote. Police leadership at the dawn of the 1940s publicly justified their explicitly reactionary Jim Crow agenda by reckoning integration a communist plot to, quote, stir up strife, end quote. Of the disposition of the city's heavily policed Black citizenry at this moment, the crisis observed that, quote, the whole atmosphere was surcharged with an electric animosity toward the Kansas City Police Authority, end quote. And indeed, Kansas City's electrically fortified atmosphere is, I think, for Murray, the issue. Murray's officers stand at the base of a severed utility pole, wired light and communication, the police's once prevailing media extensions in a dark and sprawling city, impeded by criminal sabotage. How to maintain order then, is the question. Look to the skies. Murray's clouds are undulating vapors that ooze and weave like ectoplasm through the ether, as if radiating from that police tower's 8th floor radio room below to protectively embrace the city, or depending on one's station, to ensnare it, to gather up in its atmospheric dragnet swift and executable knowledge of policeable incident. The effect is a visceral security atmosphere. The city is floor to an etheric ocean of fast and forcible policeability. Where for Ed Hopper in 1939, in Alexander Nemarov's transformative reading, a Cape Cod groundswell might have carried anxious transatlantic radio news of faraway war, these flows promise swifter and more local intra-municipal armed engagement. Murray's clouds conflate the deliberate and tactical logistical media of policing with the wild domain of the elements. Rapid armed response is offered to its city as an unstoppable force of nature, indifferent to the human, harsh but incorruptible, above politics. Still, the air is thick with it. This crime-fighting miasma shapes the built environment. Observe how the city is given by Murray to track and echo this ether's path. Murray's media infrastructural representational order, a mouthful, I'm sorry, not only describes the place to police, but also sculpts its very topography. And the sky may be the clearest marker among many of Murray's years of study, attentive study, under his teacher, the Kansas City painter Thomas Hart Benton. Its immersive presence just kisses the moon as if to absorb and extend its illuminating powers. You see that Murray lofts a surveillant blue eye in the sky there. Benton's lawless Missouri sky forms, as in his Jesse James of 1936, also wove nature's atmospheric formations with infrastructural ones, where coal smoke mingles with stratus clouds and where the light of the moon teams weakly with that of a locomotive's whale oil lamp to stitch up night and day. Benton too bisects his pictures with modern communications media. Murray has studied his teacher's painterly transmediation of sonic environments into pictorial ones, echoing, for example, Benton's 1932 Arts of the City panel with its own catalytic radio tower at center. But Murray departs from his teacher's more sanguine radio theory. Where Benton's tower issues swinging soundscapes for dancing, Murray's casts a crackling and arresting net whose objective is punitive bodily restraint. Benton, as Leo Mazzo has argued, observed in broadcast radio a technology of interconnectedness and amalgamation. Murray's compositional device, the shortwave super high frequency police radio tower, binds its public differently. It does not gather to unify, but rather unpeoples and partitions, quite in keeping with that subtending technology's own administrative ordering of the city by the logic of the scout car sector. For these policemen, police radio and the structure of policing which it engenders abstracts space and transforms the familiar human geography of the lived city into a spatial geometry of zones, overlaid by alphanumeric codes, and mediated through the anamorphic lens of fearful incident. As observed one embedded ethnographer of the medium's revised psychogeography, the patrolman's, quote, conception of the city is made different from that of the people they are paid to police. He ceases to see the city as a collection of neighborhoods and begins to see it as a mosaic of linked districts, end quote, arbitrarily drawn, and each known better by reputation than by experience. Deliberate speed of response trumps precision. The system renders the city a sequence of more or less hazardous disturbances arrayed across a grid of sectors, patrolled by heavily armed policemen cocooned in radio cars and assigned via remote dispatchers' cacophonic chirping. We might make special note of the balance of sensory inputs afforded the radio scout car driver in this 1939 press photograph on the right, and consider the quality of the view of the city he is afforded, which is slight. The medium's inherent vice is vividly imagined as a virtue in an array of photographically illustrated daily press explainers that shadow the technology's proliferation, where always some fair citizen is shown to call the police in a panic, her sanctum invaded, only to see delivered at once to the scene, quote, heavy sedans equipped with machine guns, tear gas, and other implements of warfare, calculated to subdue the desperate criminal. And that quote's drawn from the Border City Star here, which sees what's happening in Detroit and likes it and wants it for their own city in Ontario. A press print suggests something of the high craft involved in that vision's publicity. Electronic omnipresence, or constant communicative presence, as Kathleen Battles has described police radio's symbolic charge, is not subtext but the message itself, an explicit assurance of protection to the so-called fair citizen, and a menacing guarantee of swift and severe, if clumsy, violence for the rest. Another news picture, this one from the Philadelphia Inquirer in May 1940, renders all this as literally as can be imagined in a photograph. Prowl cars blanket city in radio net, reads the caption. A Margaret F. Parker of 5523 Morris Street examines the police radio map to see how the city controls the system. Police radio emerges here as a technique for the figuring and ordering of an unruly world. Photograph and painting express a common conceptual armature. Parker's arms are Murray's clouds, her eyes are Murray's moon, which returns us again to that Blahnox radio tower and its compositional order. In a rare profile of this artist, the Arizona Republic reported that Murray, quote, uses the artist's brush, and I'm fudging a little here, as a weapon in the war on crime. In that feature, we learn that his works were on occasion themselves dispatched into the city in the service of law enforcement. His depictions of pickpockets were reportedly hung in public places to warn the unsuspecting of the threat. And perhaps this sense of praxis accounts for Murray's foregrounding of the fingerprint analyst and the lab technician in his picture. The fingerprint analyst who has arrayed on his table before him a formidable arsenal in his handcuffs, his loop, and his gridded sheet of inked fingerprints. And the lab technician whose sharp optical acuity is enhanced by the newest technology. Here, Murray makes explicit his picture's weaving of manual mark making, visual scrutiny, and criminal apprehension. But I think we need to look behind those two more visible specialists of lens and ink to the figure of the dispatcher to locate the organizational core of Murray's vision. As the KC systems architect, radio engineer, and police officer Roy DeSchaffen observed in an article of 1939, quote, "The radio operator at the control desk in the transmitter room has complete observation and control over the whole system of policing in Kansas City." In his 1941 memoir, DeSchaffen's boss, Reed Lear, confirmed, including among his illustrations, 2 plates celebrating his department's radio system and its dispatchers as, quote, "the finest in America." The Kansas City Star confirmed to observe that under DeSchaffen's watch, the police department, and this is a quote, "the police department gradually was built around radio, and now it depends almost entirely upon that medium." From his central and bunkered position, Murray's dispatcher mediates between the new scientific techniques of police work and the presumptively fearsome city that these would police. And the press gladly amplified and extended Murray's enthusiasm for the dispatcher's station. In the spring of 1950, a photograph of him explaining his painting to a colleague was syndicated by the NEA News Service and published in dozens of US newspapers. Beaming, Murray directs the reader's attention to this favored detail, the dispatcher, the beholder's proxy, where police vision is in the first instance mediated by radio wave. Murray's colleague smiles along in mutual recognition, and so too did the nation's newspaper editors. Eager editorial reception of a picture like this might be understood by the light of the police radio's wildfire embraced by editors, municipality by municipality across the US, cities large and small during these years. And here I show just the slimmest example. It's a vast sea of images along these lines. To conclude, 2 more front page news photographs from the Star and its morning edition, The Times, published a decade apart and together confirming, I think, the sure confluence of painterly, criminological, radiophonic, and photographic forces in play in the midst of Murray's swirling Kansas City clouds. The first was published in the morning edition of June 18th, 1938, several months before the new headquarters opening. Toward the clouds rises new police radio tower. The photograph, with its artful conjuring of a radio antenna quite exactly as tall in its progress as a cumulus stack, establishes the new tower in its commanding bearing over the city. The picture suggests something like a common sense on the matter among makers of press and police pictures as concerns the new tower's atmospheric attachments. Its generous caption amplifies this sense to infer that this giant apparatus, quote, "constructed on top of the machinery room, immediately below which are the barred windows of the top floor jail," end quote, can be fairly counted on to leach deviants from the ether and deliver them, as if by machine, into the holding cells within. The sky itself is now charged with arresting potential, a sort of neutron bomb for the suspect. A decade later, a second page 1 picture carries us through this building's window and into its penthouse to place Murray and his practice square at the operational heart of this same astounding machinery, among the cables and relays and cells and their noise. His painting is still in progress here. The picture renders literal the integral belonging of this work of pictorial composition to the earlier photographs' announced assemblage of police signals and the carceral violence they dispatch. The caption, quote, "A noisy studio for a police department artist is the penthouse atop the 8th floor police headquarters building, where 35-year-old Charles M. Pat Murray is working on a mural for the lobby of the building. Elevator and radio equipment is located in the penthouse too, but the clicking of electrical relays and creaking of cables doesn't bother Murray, shown here sketching Sergeant Pike L. Estes, who holds a tear gas gun. In the space between the radio room and the jail, at the base of the antenna, in the noisy thick of its cloud, the police artist sketches in the gap between his own prior imaginings and the performing police who wields his weapon in compliance with the demands of representational legibility. a perfect nesting spiral of mutual reinforcements and reciprocities between the law and its representations, so aptly described decades later by Stuart Hall and his colleagues in their extraordinary book, Policing the Crisis. These photographs were aptly placed by editors, big picture news there on their respective front pages. The press minds its beat. In the first instance, the new cloud-woven antenna joined the weather as a constant and indifferent atmospheric power, sure to both generate and yield a steady flow of incident, and so a steady stream of news. In the second instance, it was clear already that same function, the efficient manufacture of policeable incident by the partitioning and abstracting of a dynamic industrial city into an array of discrete, sonically defined sectors to be visited upon by guns and poison gas, according to the encoded chirp and squeak of a centralized and siloed dispatcher. It was clear that this function would depend on the sound, if generic, powers of pictorial synthesis and compression afforded by the likes of Officer Murray, one component among many in the new instrumentation. Thanks.
Okay, hopefully you can just see my slides.
Yes, everything is great.
So I'd like to thank the organizers, especially Tatiana, Acacia, and David at the Courtauld, and all of the presenters. I am currently knee-deep in reinstalling the museum's galleries dedicated to 19th century American art now, and this feels a bit like being in the future, to be honest, rather than in the past. It's fun for me to be in the 40s for a couple of days. Edward Hopper's Summertime is a knockout painting with classic Hopper hallmarks. A woman is on her own in an urban setting. Just the hint of a narrative is implied by her pose, with waiting on a doorstep with an open door and an open window behind her. Against a cool-toned and linear backdrop, she is all curves and warm colors: red hair, red lips, yellow hat, pink skin. The flesh of her breasts and thighs is visible through her thin cotton dress. One scholar described Summertime as Hopper's sexiest painting. She's quite nearly a pinup girl, perhaps one left alone in the city while soldiers are off at war. But that's not the subject of this paper, just my casual observations based on the talks we've heard so far. This modern day stunner hangs, perhaps improbably, in the Delaware Art Museum, a regional institution serving the small city of Wilmington. Along with works by Andrew Wyeth and Huey Lee Smith, this Hopper anchors our collection of art from the 1940s in all of its heteronormative realist glory. Today, I want to explore how this masterpiece landed in my regional art museum and the collector who brought it to Delaware. In fact, Summertime has been hanging in this neighborhood since 1945, when it was purchased by John L. Sexton, a retired contractor and art collector. Summertime was one of Hopper's 2 oil paintings from 1943, the year after he completed Nighthawks and sold it to the Art Institute of Chicago within 6 months. Right after he finished Summertime, and Hopper exhibited this painting extensively. The canvas was shown at annual exhibitions of the Whitney Museum and the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts in 1943, and the following year, he sent it to the Corcoran Biennial. When the painting returned to New York, Hopper's dealer, Frank Rain, may have suspected he could quickly find a home for it. Because the artist produced only 1 or 2 major oils each year, collectors like Sexton might be waiting. On May 9th, 1945, exactly 2 years and 1 day after Hopper recorded the completion of Summertime in his record book, Sexton mailed Rain the check for it. And when the painting arrived on May 15, he wrote to Rain, "I am glad that I, at last, have a Hopper." John L. Sexton was an unusual art collector in Wilmington. He was well off, unmarried and childless when, seemingly out of nowhere, he began collecting art seriously. It was 1928 and he was 51 years old. Over the next decade, he renovated the 3rd floor of his home, adding skylights, electric lights, and improved heating to better display a growing collection. By the time of his death in 1955, Sexton had acquired about 50 oil paintings and watercolors by modern American artists, including Hopper, Charles Birchfield, Morris Cantor, Julian Levi, Paul Cadmus, and others. Upon his death, his collection was divided between the Delaware Art Museum and his alma mater, Mount St. Mary's. It was a transformative gift for a small museum with limited acquisition funds and limited board support for buying modern art. Sexton's ability to collect art derived from his father's successful contracting business. Sexton was well off, but not generationally wealthy. He lived in a very big brick house in the city, but not on a large estate in the rolling hills outside of Wilmington, where the real money resides. Sexton had 4 sisters, and he followed his father into contracting. Their wealth made the Sextons prominent citizens, and they were in the local papers regularly for their donations to charitable causes. The patriarch of the family, Michael Sexton, died in 1926. Within 2 years, John retired from contracting and began collecting art. While he continued to be listed as a donor to various good causes in the local papers, John also rated mention for winning at an all-night checkers tournament in 1931 and staying at the Waldorf Astoria. His niece remembered him going to the racetrack, investing in the stock market, playing the violin, writing a book, and learning to paint, as well as traveling back and forth to New York to see and buy art. Suddenly, John Sexton was living his best life. This was not how most wealthy Wilmingtonians behaved. He was, she said, the eccentric uncle. Sexton's art collection started with the work of Charles Birchfield, specifically with this painting, Lilacs, which he took possession of not long after it won the Jenny Sesnan Medal at the Pennsylvania Academy in 1929. Sexton's purchase of Lilacs establishes some of the major characteristics of his collection. Sexton bought American. As he explained to one local reporter, "I usually only buy Americans. I like their work, vigorous, individual, and permanent." Sexton often bought what we would call emerging artists. He purchased Lilacs when Birchfield was 35 and starting to receive significant notice as an artist. Throughout his collection, Sexton not only bought the work of living artists, he bought the work of younger artists. Hopper was an exception to this rule. Sexton bought Lilacs not long after Birchfield painted it. With the exception of some later purchases of Birchfield's early work, in every example where I could trace the date of a work and the date of its purchase, Sexton acquired his pictures within 3 years of their production. Lilac was shown and awarded at the Pennsylvania Academy, and Sexton would go on to buy 7 paintings that were shown in the Academy's annuals. And over half of the artists that ended up in his collection exhibited at annuals regularly. For those of you who don't know where Delaware is, we're only about 30 miles from Philadelphia, where the Pennsylvania Academy is located. So this would be a close place for him to see a lot of artists from around the country. In general, he bought work that was exhibited publicly. He bought work exhibited and awarded at the National Academy, and at least 3 paintings shown at the Whitney annuals. He purchased works shown at the Carnegie, and over half of the works half of the artists in his collection showed at MoMA during the 1930s and 40s. But Sexton did not depend on museums to introduce him to new work. He frequented New York galleries. Lilacs was purchased from Montross galleries in New York, and Sexton would patronize several of the burgeoning number of dealers specializing in modern American art, including Montross, Macbeth, Babcock, Grand Central, Mortimer Levitt, and more than any others, the Downtown Gallery, and especially Frank Green Gallery. Sexton was very much the kind of mid-range collector that supported these galleries day in and day out. Now we see a Birchfield that he acquired in the late 1930s, March, which was probably the most significant watercolor in Sexton's collection. Birchfield's Lilacs and March give some clues as to Sexton's personal taste, as well as his collecting. Both of these Birchfields are kind of dark in tone, and like Summertime, they're dominated by gray and blue and feature strong linear elements. These components reappear in his collection again and again. And indeed, his niece said that when he tried painting, the work was also blue and angular. In addition, the overall mood of Lilacs and March is a bit foreboding. According to the collector, "I don't know why, I seem to prefer something melancholy or even macabre." Birchfield remained the collector's favorite, and Sexton eventually bought 9 works by the artist. At least 7 of them were in his collection before 1939. Over the Village is an early example of Birchfield's work, one of the few items that Sexton bought well after it had been finished. Mid-Morning in June is a subdued regionalist picture for Birchfield. At first glance, it's less dark and broody than most of the work Sexton collected. But if you look closely, you'll notice that something seems to have gone terribly wrong with the house at left. As the son of a contractor who couldn't wait to retire from contracting, I do wonder about the appeal of all these dilapidated structures for Sexton. And now I can't help thinking about the contrast between Birchfield's rundown structures and the solid vernacular buildings of Hopper and Alt. With their mysterious, threatening atmosphere, William Ferguson's watercolor landscapes certainly suggest the influence of Charles Birchfield. Ferguson was a Philadelphia-based artist who frequently exhibited at the Academy Annuals, but this work wasn't shown there. It was likely purchased from Carlin Gallery in Philadelphia, where Ferguson was represented, though Sexton seems to also have known Ferguson personally and takes credit for naming one of his pictures in a newspaper article. Sexton purchased only a handful of works by local or regional artists, including 3 by Ferguson. We know these Birchfields and the watercolors by Ferguson, as well as works by Stuart Eadie, Rainey Bennett, and John Stenval, were in Sexton's collection by 1939, when he lent them to this exhibition, the Lone Exhibition of Watercolors. At the time, he owned about 34 paintings, 12 of which were the watercolors he lent. Sexton had been a member of the Wilmington Society of the Fine Arts, which was the forerunner of the Delaware Art Museum, for quite a while, but in 1939, it was discovered by the museum that he had a gallery full of contemporary art in his home when he offered to lend to the watercolor show. The society had recently moved into Sexton's neighborhood. A little background on the museum. The Wilmington Society of the Fine Arts was founded in 1912 after the death of American illustrator Howard Pyle, who lived and taught in Wilmington. Members of the community here came together to purchase 128 of the paintings left in his studio. Soon the society began organizing annual exhibitions, first of Pyle and then of his students, some of whom, like N.C. Wyeth and Frank Schoonover, were in the area and helped found the society. These shows morphed into annual juried shows that largely attracted local and regional artists, as well as illustrators. The society began to occupy space in the library downtown in the 1920s and began organizing other types of exhibitions and expanding their collecting to encompass 19th and early 20th century American art. In 1935, the society received a bequest from Samuel Bancroft that included his collection of Pre-Raphaelite paintings and a plot of land on which to build a museum. The building, then called the Delaware Art Center, opened in 1938. So the museum, as we think of it now, had existed for only about a year when Sexton lent his watercolors. And Sexton would have been well aware of the museum as it was being constructed. Door to door, his house is 317 steps from the entrance of the museum. So it seems a little odd that no one affiliated with the museum knew he was collecting art for 10 years, particularly when you consider how limited the museum's collection was, even before it was a neighbor of his. By 1939, the collection numbered over 1,700 works, but almost 1,300 of those were by Pyle, and over 150 were Pre-Raphaelites. Much of the rest was the work of Pyle's students like Schoonover and Wyeth or other illustrators. The museum's purchase funds, first established in 1926, were quite limited and dedicated to purchasing primarily the pupils of Howard Pyle. When the museum opened, it featured 3 galleries each of Pyle and Pre-Raphaelite art, with 4 smaller galleries for everything else. In the late 1930s, the collections began to broaden, with purchases of work by Edward Loper, Robert Brackman, and Leon Kroll. We brought these 2 paintings from an exhibition of contemporary paintings gathered from New York dealers and circulated by Robert Macbeth. The show included younger artists like Birchfield, Hopper, and John Corbino, but also well-established artists born in the 1860s and 1870s like John Sloan and Edward Redfield. all under the banner of contemporary painting. Sexton's collection was more current and edgy than anything the museum had on hand. Sexton's advanced taste became even more apparent when a local reporter convinced Sexton to give him an interview and a tour of his house, providing more information about the collector and his interests. While he identified Birchfield as the collector's favorite, the reporter added, "But give him a real surrealist or an oil painting by some of the younger radical painters. He's happy." The reporter went on to describe some of the so-called crazy pictures in Sexton's home. The most outlandish were two surrealist paintings by Federico Castellan. I've not been able to track down Sexton's Castellans, but they may have been something like this work from Michael Rosenfeld's gallery. The collector admitted, "Some of my friends think I'm crazy to buy such paintings." Another so-called crazy picture of a very different sort was Lee Gatch's Pennsylvania farm, which the reporter described as a cubist's subconscious realization of farm life. Of Cadmus, the reporter noted, "Cadmus has often been characterized as the bad boy of art, but the painting Sexton has is a conventional, beautiful picture." And it is indeed a gorgeous tempera painting of Cadmus's sister and Lincoln Kirstein's wife, Fidelma. It's also likely that Sexton owned these paintings by Charles Stafford Duncan and Reginald Marsh by 1939, but they didn't even rate mention by the reporter. So we have a basic sense of Sexton's growing collection: Birchfield, other moody landscapes, some surrealism, some cubism, and paintings of women kind of living in their heads. Overall, moody, macabre vibes and lots of blue, green, and gray. When Sexton loaned to the 1939 watercolor exhibition, his moody modernists appeared alongside works from two other private collections, very different collections. Both other collectors were women in the DuPont family, and their collections stretched from the 19th century to contemporary. So the show was not focused on contemporary watercolors. Indeed, it went from John Singer Sargent and Winslow Homer all the way to Andrew Wyeth. Mrs. Wheelwright's collection, she lent 53 things, was particularly strong. I do wish she had given the whole thing to the museum. She lent works by Akins and Homer, as well as American Impressionists and contemporary artists. And it is worth noting her early ownership of an Andrew Wyeth. Wyeth had his first solo show at Macbeth in 1937 and his first solo museum show at the Courier in 1939, when he was just 22. The Art Museum acquired our first Wyeth, also a watercolor, here, Winter Orchard, in 1940. And Wyeth was, of course, on the fast track career-wise in the late 30s and early 40s. In 1941, he was elected for membership in the American Watercolor Society. At age 23, he was the youngest member ever chosen. Wyeth was even younger than the artists supported by Sexton, and he was just coming onto the scene in 1939. In his interview with the newspaper, Sexton mentioned both Wyeth and his brother-in-law, Peter Hurd, as talented local artists, although he never acquired works by either, which is surprising considering that they were among the most influential and heavily collected artists in this area by the museum and by our audience. So while the museum and our local collectors are turning toward the Wyeth family, let's look and see how Sexton's collection grows through the 40s. In the early 40s, he continued to acquire Birchfield, including, as I said, earlier works like The Incredible Mysterious Bird and Evening Star. He also acquired other dark and moody landscape paintings, like this picture by Raymond Breenan, The Village Up High. Unfortunately, it is in poor condition. So you can see that, as you can see on the slide. Occasionally, he acquired more surrealist work. Sexton purchased this from Julian Levi's first solo show at the Downtown Gallery in 1944. Edward Alden Jules singled it out in the New York Times, saying, "Common objects associated with the life of fishermen appear transformed into strange, arresting shapes. A bit of twisted old pier, an ancient weathered bulkhead, boots set out to dry on the sand." driftwood, buoys with their wraith-like flags. These can appear caught as in a trance, yet somehow animate, and they are as real as is the occasional human figure, introduced with telling casualness, intensifying the spell of breathless, salt-steeped, wind-swept melancholy. The show and this painting were so popular that Edith Halpert wrote to Sexton asking to keep the work after he'd bought it a bit longer, as the exhibition was being extended, and this was one of the most popular works in it. In 1942, Sexton returned to buying works featuring broody women with two purchases from the Rain Gallery. Here, Henry Varnum Poor's fairly benign Girl in Blue Blouse, and Elizabeth Sparhawk Jones' spectacularly creepy The Dreamer. And I just have to show a bigger image of the Sparhawk Jones. It's one of my favorite things in this collection. I have a dream of hanging it right next to the Hopper at some point. After achieving early success in a very different style, Elizabeth Sparhawk Jones returned to the art world in the 1930s. And by 1942, she was exhibiting paintings like this that combined forceful drawing and compact flesh tones with a vague underwater quality, according to critics, as well as mysterious symbolism. If you look here, you'll see that there's a nude woman laid out on a rock. In front of her is a skeleton sort of leaning up against the rock. And then here are men in business suits kind of abducting naked women in this painting called The Dream. Perhaps influenced by surrealism, Freudian analysis, and her own mental health problems, Sparhawk Jones' strange visionary paintings attracted a wide range of reactions, including support from the nation's art critics in the early 40s. Sparhawk Jones is one of only 3 women in Sexton's collection, alongside local artists Margaretta Hinchman and Frida McAdam. In the 40s, Sexton really leaned into purchasing kind of haunting, mysterious images of women. Paul Meltzner is best known for his evocative paintings of Martha Graham and her troupe, and his work was handled by the Midtown Gallery. John Carroll's neo-romantic portraits of misty-eyed women were extremely popular in the 40s, though he was practically forgotten by the time of his death. Carroll actually made a lithograph of this subject, Ribbons. It's kind of equally dreadful. And the subject here is probably his wife, Pinky, although she doesn't look very cheerful and pinky in this picture. Carroll won a purchase prize from the Pennsylvania Academy that allowed him to study in Europe in 1925. And upon his return, he taught at the Art Students League of New York and received a Guggenheim Fellowship. Carroll's evocative landscapes and depictions of dreamy women were widely exhibited and collected in the mid-20th century when Frank Rain was his dealer. And Sexton owned a landscape that was very popular among his sisters and one of his favorites, as well as this painting of Pinky. Modernist landscapes, both Cubist and Precisionist, continued to enter his collection. The artist on the right, Eugene Trentham, is based in Texas, as is Everett Franklin Spruce. More modernist landscapes, including a work by Morris Cantor, who's a fascinating artist from the 30s and 40s, who experimented with pretty much every style from folk art to cubism to abstraction available in mid-century. Sexton bought the Cantor here, Harbor, at the same time that he bought his Hopper, although for $450 compared to the $2,200 for the Hopper. Obviously, Sexton had been following Cantor's ever-changing career because he wrote to Rain, "I think this is the most beautiful and gripping abstraction I have ever seen. Mr. Cantor is, to my way of thinking, a master in that sort of painting. I hope he sticks to it." So it's worth noting that by the late 1940s, the museum is catching up to Sexton's taste. When Sexton's bequest arrived, works by Spruce and Cantor were already in the collection. They had been purchased in the 40s. A few years later, Sexton purchased this abstraction by Hawaiian artist Reuben Tam, a work shown at the Pennsylvania Academy. Sexton likely bought this from the Downtown Gallery. While it has things in common with the Cantor and the Lee Gatch that he about a decade earlier, the TAM features a more expressionist take on abstraction. It's active brushwork. But we shouldn't read Sexton's collecting as an evolution toward abstract expressionism to any degree. He buys the Rubin TAM around the same time that he buys the Hopper. And he continues to kind of move all around through the styles that are available in the 1940s, returning to more straightforward landscape painting, as well as cityscape here by Arthur Osver, clearly inspired by Cubism. When I spoke to Sexton's niece about the collection, she recalled it as being primarily blue and angular, as well as his own amateur paintings. In 1950, Sexton would show his collection at the museum again, this time far more of it, and it would be greeted with admiration by the local press. None of his pictures seemed all that crazy a decade later. The press treated the work with respect and contrasted it with more confusing modern painting, writing, "Contemporary art to many citizens means just one thing: bright and dark daubs of paint, strange line formations, and a general impression of confusion as to what the artist meant. The Sexton collection is different." The writer went on to describe both so-called normal works and paintings as paintings whose subject matter is quite comprehensible, and works like Rubin TAM's Driftwood, leaning on the collector's words to build interest in the more abstract works. The author concluded by noting that this is a rare opportunity to see, in a group, representative trends of a much discussed field. It's worth noting that even in 1950, the museum chose not to display Sexton's surrealist Castellan paintings from the 30s. He sends them, the museum insures them, but a note indicates that they are not hung in the gallery. As the press coverage implied, by 1950, Sexton's collection wasn't exactly at the cutting edge. Although he was one of the most adventurous collectors in Wilmington, and he amassed a strong and representative collection of modern American painting. Even at his most daring, Sexton mostly stayed toward the middle of Ad Reinhardt's famous tree of modern art, among what Reinhardt termed those curious schools, which somehow think of themselves as being both abstract and pictorial. The friendly critical response to Sexton's exhibition may also reflect the museum board's desire by 1950, when Sexton was 73 years old and lacking obvious heirs, to own some of these works. It may also speak to the fact that Sexton had become part of the Wilmington art community in the 1940s. Coming out of his hiding, sharing his collection, and joining the Rehoboth Art League, showing his own work, lending individual works to other museum shows, and jurying exhibitions alongside Frank Schoonover. He was truly part of the Wilmington art world, and the museum was delighted to welcome these works into the collection. I've been delighted to have the chance through this paper to research these works. When I first looked at Sexton's collection about 17 years ago now, I was fascinated that a single upper middle class collector purchased a world-class Hopper, a beautiful Cadmus, and several fantastic Birchfields, as well as works by a dozen artists that I'd never heard of. Thank you.
And it is my great pleasure to introduce our second plenary speaker, Alexander Namarov. He is Carroll and Marilyn Thoma Provostial Professor in the Arts and Humanities and the Chair of the Department of Art and Art History at Stanford University. Professor Namarov has written extensively on American art and visual culture of the 19th and 20th centuries, and his broader intellectual preoccupations include the questions of the presence of art, the recollection of the past, and the importance of the humanities in our lives today. He's the author of numerous books on American art and visual culture, including Ralph Eugene Meteor, American Mystic, published in 2018, Summoning Pearl Harbor, that appeared in 2017, Soulmaker, The Times of Louis Hine, as well as Wartime Kiss, Visions of the Moment in the 1940s, Acting in the Night, Macbeth, and the Places of the Civil War from 2010, Icons of Grief, Val Newton's Homefront Pictures from 2005, and The Body of Raphael Peale, Still Life and Selfhood from 2001. His most recent book, Fierce Poise, Helen Frankenthaler and 1950s New York, was published just this year by Penguin Press. And he also, in addition to publishing extensively, he also curated a number of exhibitions, including To Make a World, George Alt and 1940s America, which took place at the Smithsonian American Art Museum in 2011. Professor Namarov is currently working on a new book, The Forest, A Fable of America in the 1830s, to be published by Princeton University Press, which is based on the Andrew Mellon lectures that he gave at the National Gallery in 2017. Excuse me. So with that said, I hand it over to Alexander Namarov.
Thank you, Tatiana, for that warm introduction, and thank you, Tatiana and David, for this wonderful conference. I think it's been fantastic. The 1940s have never been so interesting as they've been for me in the past 2 days, and my thanks to all the panelists. I would like to take advantage of my place here as the last presenter to just I suppose, meditate more broadly on what it is we even think we're doing when we write history or think historically. And I do want to do this with specific reference to the Second World War, and even, if you like, to American culture, despite the presence of a French painting, the French painting, on which I will concentrate today on the screen. That is Berthe Morisot's The Harbor at Lorient from 1869. Let me say this, that I think what's at stake in my talk, and I feel that a number of presenters have broached these kinds of issues already in the last 2 days, Angela, Louis, Andrew, for example, is a series of questions having to do with time, how to think of being outside of time as itself a way of creating or experiencing historical consciousness, so a paradox. Another paradox, what is the relation between memory and forgetting, and how is forgetting or oblivion, which is the title of my talk today, a form of recollection? What is the relation between personal history, and I loved Andrew's window into his process there, going to the different places where Darren was. What is the relation of personal experience, personal history to these larger histories? That is our personal history as we experience the larger history that we imagine ourselves as existing apart from, at least in the fiction of being a scholar. So these are then some of my questions, and I'm going to talk about this painting, speaking of memory and personal history, a painting that I've always loved since I was graduating from high school in St. Louis, Missouri, not long before I met our distinguished speaker from yesterday, Angela Miller, who was soon to be starting as an assistant professor at Washington University there. But I was just graduating from high school in 1981, and a friend of the family, as a present to me, a friend who was getting her master's degree at a place called Fontbonne College in St. Louis, gave me a copy of John Rewald's History of Impressionism, a book I still have. And in this book, I was just so struck by this color illustration of this painting by Morisot, struck in my 18-year-old sense or self, without really, of course, noting it or thinking very deeply about it, but just being touched by it unaccountably. And in the way of things, here we are, 39 years later in my case, and I'm presenting on this painting. So it's a painting that Morisot made when she was in her late 20s, and it shows her sister, Edma, E-D-M-A, and Edma is shown in the French harbor town of Lorient so on the coast, and she's there, Edma, but also Bertha, despite them both being, upper middle class, like high bourgeois Parisians, because Edma has just married earlier this year of 1869 a naval officer named Adolphe Pontillon, and she's therefore moved to the provinces, and she's also done something else, which is she's given up not her career as a painter necessarily, but her practice as a painter. Both the sisters were interested in art and were encouraged by their parents to study art. And what you have here, if you're looking at Edma and you're thinking that she is sitting there on that stone wall with this, I think it's fair to say, some kind of introspective or melancholy demeanor. One thing that this represents right off the bat is some sense of regret or forlornness or melancholy about having given up Paris, having also given up her love of painting, right, to become a wife, and soon enough she would be pregnant, in fact. So that's just a little bit of the personal history. Berthe came out to visit her sister that summer of 1869. But I think thinking about this picture, which by the way is at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., and it's not a very large painting, it's 17 by 28 inches. I think it broadens out into a more philosophical space. It is, to me, just such a lovely, haunting painting. And, one of the things I think about with it is that, it has to do with daydream, with reverie. The water in the harbor there is so indicative for me of consciousness, the way it kind of splays and spreads to some extent out of or in relation to Edma's body, the way she is partitioned from that on this beautifully painted wall, sketchily painted wall, but is also kind of giving on to this space that is both reflective and, if you like, superficial, but also deep, and the way her body kind of skews out into the architecture of the harbor is interesting too. The way her hat, the darkness of her hat connects to the hulls of those boats, which I'm recalling is the thing I loved absolutely the most about this painting when I saw it first. In any case, this is, to me, I think the thing I have always loved about this picture, that it's taken me almost 4 decades to realize it, is that it's about not just consciousness, but some sort of indescribable mix of desire and regret, or desire and, let's say, regret, not just regret, but meditation on what is lost. Okay. And, thinking about this a little bit further and thinking about the picture now meta pictorially, or like in terms of its intertexts, let's say, I'm going to give you two pictures that I feel this, two kinds of picture that I feel this work is in dialogue with. And in each case, I hope that what I say will expand, build on what I've just provisionally set forth. So the first kind of picture I feel that the harbor at Lorient is in dialogue with, probably unconsciously, is scenes of the Annunciation. So I pick one that used to be attributed to Leonardo and is now given to Lorenzo di Credi, that was and is at the Louvre, so the museum where Morisot, like Edma, spent a lot of time copying the old master paintings. In any case, the Annunciation, where you have the Virgin Mary, receiving the word from the angel that she will bear the Son of God. And you might be saying, well, what is the relation here exactly? And I guess it's a relation that's made of a non-relation, and it contributes to our understanding of what reverie is in this work. Because, if you accept the idea that Edma is in the position, roughly speaking, of the Virgin Mary in scenes of the Annunciation, then you will immediately notice that there is no corresponding second figure, that is the figure of the angel, that in fact all of this is where that angel should be, is emptiness. And from this, I would just deduce a very simple thought, which is that God is dead, that this is a Nietzschean, this is a work that comes from, a decade before Nietzsche's Gay Science and the famous statement that God is dead, and that even without Nietzsche, we're just dealing in a time, very broadly speaking, in which, metaphysical religious certitudes of different kinds, guarantees, are instead no longer there, and they've been replaced by the ambivalent compensation, like the the sort of double-edged compensation of openness and dream and reverie and possibility, which admits at the same time a kind of atmosphere of desire and possibility, and indeed voyaging, mental voyaging along a calm horizontal of rumination, let's call it, and also a kind of melancholy because there's nothing there, it's just nothing there. It's sort of like giving a paper, right? It goes into a void, right? And you have to kind of, as a modern, you kind of have to come to terms with that unlike the police radio, where there's an administrative and militarized call and response and so on, that being an artist or a thinker and so on is really just about this void, which is to be alone with one's consciousness, which is tied in with the so-called social world, but is also seemingly something different from it. So, right, so reverie is what I've said, and I've tried to give you some kind of connotation of what reverie and regret might suggest historically in this picture. But I want to now go to my second intertext, or rather just to build out just very briefly the obvious criticisms of reverie as having anything to do with what you would think this conference is about, namely, like, we're here to understand, we're here to, in a historical and political way, understand the charge of the 1940s, then and now, and so on. And you might think, well, reverie is extremely miscast in any conception along those lines. And I would say, yes, if you thought that, you'd be in very good company. I mean, leaving aside the question of how is this painting from 1869 going to possibly be related to the Second World War, you could just say, in terms of histories of consciousness, like, okay, if this is a picture about this high bourgeois reverie, the part of, a privileged painter and her privileged sister and so on, it's like, this is very far afield from most, if not all, the talks we've heard today that have all been wonderful, and yesterday too. So yes, there's plenty of good company to say this is not the stuff of historical consciousness. Walter Benjamin, says it this way: even the great moments of world history are only costumes beneath which, and he's accounting for, like, bourgeois dreaminess, beneath which they exchange glances of complicity with nothingness, the petty and the banal. Such nihilism is the innermost core of bourgeois coziness, a mood that in hashish intoxication concentrates to satanic contentment, satanic knowing, satanic calm, all of life just a stimulus to intoxication and dream. So you might say, like, the sort of real social political connotations of these ships and so on become just a stimulus to intoxication and dream. And Adorno puts it similarly when he says inwardness is the historical prison of primordial human nature. So it's a kind of construct, the very opposite of a natural way of being that isolates ourselves from a person from experience. So her walled offness is a part of that which I think Adorno critiques. And you could even say, when I think about what the two Morisot sisters, the two I'm concerned with today, were even reading at the time, there's further notion, or further proof, if you like, of this irrelevance of reverie to historical consciousness. And it consists in the form of the book they were reading, which is nothing less than Flaubert's Madame Bovary. They both really liked this book, and I just choose a passage almost at random from this book in which famously the heroine is committed to daydreaming and reading sentimental fiction, and it doesn't work out well for her. So down in her soul, the while she was waiting for something to happen, reading romance novels like a shipwrecked sailor, she perused her solitary world with hopeless eyes, searching for some white sail far away where the horizon turns to mist. So again, like I'm just stacking the deck here to portray the idea that dreaminess is not commensurate with historical consciousness as we mostly know it, as very powerful thinkers have legitimated the critique of, and so on. But now, the second intertext, I think with it, I want to push back on this idea and perhaps counterintuitively say that there's something going on here which is more complex. So I mentioned Morisot went to the Louvre to look at pictures, and when I look at the figure of Edma as she sits on that parapet, that wall, I feel that figure is even directly haunted by this painting by Poussin, Echo and Narcissus at the Louvre, which is a painting I love and always go to see there, but not by the figure of Narcissus, not by the little Puto, but by the figure of Echo. And many of you will know that the story of Narcissus actually concerns two figures, not just the sort of self-absorbed young man, but also the nymph, the forest nymph who loves him, Echo. And Echo in the story eventually wastes away from unrequited love and exists only as a voice in book 3 of Ovid's Metamorphosis. And when I think of Echo and think of how moving she is just in the story, but also in this painting where she's in the business of turning into the rocks and trees, etc. So she becomes just a disembodied voice. I think of her as such a figure for history, at least as I conceive it. And, in book 3, I just find this description by Ovid to be such a powerful description of what a historian might be. Scorned, she wanders in the woods and hides her face in shame away among the leaves. And from that time on, lives in lonely caves, right? History is lonely, but still her love endures, for some unrequited thing or being, increased by the sadness of rejection. Her sleepless thoughts waste her sad form. Her body's strength vanishes into the air, and her bones and the sound of her voice, and only her bones and the sound of her voice are left. Her voice remains. Her bones, they say, were changed to shape of stone. She hides in the woods, no longer to be seen on the hills, but to be heard by everyone. It is that sound that lives in her. So this idea of Echo as the person who cannot be silent when others have spoken, nor learn how to speak first herself. It sounds like such
the model of the historian who cannot be silent when others have spoken, nor learn how to speak first herself. We're people who don't speak first. We wait for others to speak. Then we, from some, I would say, from some ambivalent position of desire and regret, we then waste away. In effect, like it's a hard job. You know, I've been doing it for 29 years. It's fun, but it's hard. And it comes at certain kinds of costs. Studying the Second World War takes a piece out of you for sure, as I know everyone's topics here do. It's just you echo something and you waste away. So in a very complex emotional relation to what you study. So I just think if you look at this figure and like this figure, I guess there's sort of absolute quote unquote plausibility or convincingness of the connection is really not the point. I'm just drawing them together creatively and asking you to think that Edna on that stone wall is a figure not just of reverie, but of echo. And if so, then two seeming opposites are joined in Morisot's picture, namely, you know, a kind of, if you like, historical consciousness, namely that of the echo with a dreamingness. And I guess at stake here, even if my talk just ended right now, I would say that I would maintain that historical consciousness and reverie are absolutely related. And I can already tell that as undogmatic as I try to be in my life within my failings, I would say I will never change that viewpoint. So, which I don't say tendentiously, I'm just saying, wow, that it's just kind of how I am. In any case, let's build on this a little bit though, and say that if she's about echo, then what's going to happen here? You know, in some ways, I would say she's conscious of her own disappearance then, and that the melancholy of this is about a kind of memento mori even, you know, that dreaming is connected to the way in which oneself just disappears. And if you go forward now to Lorient as it existed after June 1940, when the Germans took it over and converted it into one of their central U-boat bases, from which really they almost won the Second World War in 1940-41. That is to say, the U-boats coming out of Lorient, where these massive concrete pens were built to house some of the U-boat fleet, were so lethal in destroying the lifeline shipping from the United States to not only the Soviet Union, but also England, that it was close. It was close to, the Nazis were close to just simply strangling Britain and Soviet Union. And, you know, we're now in that space where if you go back to this picture and you look at some of these houses, we're basically talking about the same kind of space. Same place where Edna sat, but it's now been converted into this hugely strategically important space for the German military. And indeed, in a certain way, the space on which the whole fate of the world depends. And as I look at some of the photographs I've been able to find of German crewmen who were working in this incredibly hazardous profession, since 70% of those crews are to this day at the bottom of the ocean, and I see them sitting on, you know, these stone walls. It does prompt certain reflections about historical time and about how, more specifically, how this picture is going to prefigure, or how it even might be said to know about what will come there at Lorient. And I think the most striking of these pictures is this one, at least of the ones I've been able to find, where German officers, on shore leave are able to have a smiling, pleasant moment there at what looks like, almost perhaps the very same angled bit of stone wall there on the promenade at Lorient. So oblivion, one reading of oblivion here is that, it's as though Edmund never existed, as though the complexities and real human emotions of one person, indeed two people, if you count her sister, never occurred, and it's, speaking of memento mori, it's just the way it is, right? We occupied the space that was once occupied, and unless by some kind of intensive Herculean act of mind, we happen to conjure that which is no longer there, it simply is not present. It's vanished and things are forgotten. Another notion of oblivion, though, is a little bit more social political, and it has to do with, if you like, the complicity of this kind of dreaming, even if it is connected to echoing and historical awareness with what's happened over here. Hannah Arendt talks about, in The Origins of Totalitarianism, the complicity of the bourgeoisie in creating the monsters of fascism, in the sense that the bourgeoisie, you could nominate the Morisot sisters in this regard, as having delegated all moral responsibility to basically outsourced all moral responsibility to police forces, to other external entities to handle outsiders, handle criminals, handle the marginalized, handle the mentally ill, whatever the case may be, that they sort of reap the whirlwind, in the sense that ultimately all of the excised people gather their resentment into sufficiently strong power as to then go about killing those who have systematically repressed them, oppressed them, etc. So that there is, again, this degree of complicity between bourgeois oblivion and then the power that supplants it. And, along those lines, you could say, as we come to an artist who's much featured in our 2 days, Edward Hopper, and his painting from 1939, New York Movie, that this too is about this kind of, nothing is about anything in a Hopper picture, but it's open to being understood, this painting, as being about, now in 1939 itself, a kind of self-absorption, a double self-absorption. There's the mass absorption of popular entertainment, the culture industry over here. There's a movie going on. And then there's the usherette in her own private world with her almost allegorical attributes of mind, the tripled lamp, the stairs, etc., the gateway, and that, the world is burning while she is thinking her own private thoughts. And in the Hannah Arendt way, you could say that her obliviousness, and indeed the kind of castle of oblivion that is a movie theater, is complicit in the world burning, right? So when I look at this figure, and thinking back to, say, what Louis was talking about earlier, like hearkening to Hopper's training in Paris, I think that, the usherette, in a long history of, or long foreground of Hopper's paintings, comes from impressionist figures of reverie, and such as Morisot's, and that structurally both these pictures are about a kind of oblivion, right? So if you were just keeping score right now, you'd say it doesn't, after Hannah Arendt comes on the scene, it doesn't look too good in terms of our figure of memory / desire caught up in her own deep superficiality, like that of the, that sort of moat-like basin or harbor. It doesn't look too good for her as being a model for what we do. But let's think about the other kind of oblivion, and that I think Edma on her stone wall understands, which is Lorient, because of its strategic importance, was bombed basically into nothingness starting in February 1943. 90% of the town was destroyed, mainly because the Allies were interested in just bombing out the housing of all of the German workers who enabled the submarine operations. And this was nothing if not crucial, as I hope I've made clear, because of the U-boats' dire threat, not only to Atlantic shipping, but indeed to the outcome of the whole war. So yes, so you're looking at a representative aerial photograph. So Edma is, if you like, the angel of history, the muse of history, occupying a space in which there's a double disappearance. One is that of herself, but that also of the place where she is, and that she, as some kind of unlikely angel of history, presides over a space of complete oblivion, complete disappearance that is yet, for that very reason, a kind of space of memory. And the memory I have in mind is not that of the actual submarine pens themselves, which survive to this day because made of reinforced concrete, they were absolutely indestructible even to the largest bombs. And so you could say that, well, the memory of the Second World War at Lorient does continue there in the form of a few material manifestations of incredible significance, such as this, then you'd be right. But that's not necessarily the connection of oblivion and memory that I'm thinking of here today. I'm thinking of something that doesn't exist. And if we come back to this, I think what's so evocative for me about this picture, and keep in mind, I'm not trying to be right here or prove anything. I'm just sharing my thoughts about this picture as a touchstone for me, is that it deals in a kind of suspended time. This goes a little bit to my conversation with Angela yesterday about frozen and suspended time. I just feel there's Edma. You can't see her feet. She's kind of poised a little bit in air, seated on the ground on this stone wall. She's touching the wall with a curiously immaterial hand, as though material and immaterial sensation are dovetailed perfectly. Her face is somewhat obscured. There is, moreover, in the beautiful water itself and the sense of stillness, which I think is not frozenness, but is a kind of bobbingness or kind of gentle rocking, a sense of time suspended here. Yeah. And I think for me, the moment of oblivion, the moment of desire and echo is a suspenseful moment. It's a sensation, not an intellectual construct. It's a feeling one has at certain times that one is at the edge of something that is made by one's own consciousness, but is not purely that consciousness, but is somehow of the world itself, that the world is, in this moment of suspension, reflecting, giving you your own reflections about your place in time as both, one little bit in a long stream of time, but also as connected to other times. Are we connected to the 1940s in more than just a social and political way? I would say we are, or potentially in different sensations, different experiences, perhaps always and only in, let's call it a strange town, a new town, right? Where everything is sort of familiar, but is also different. And in a new situation, perhaps connected with having given up something, having lost something, that we become alive, it becomes possible for us to be impregnated by a kind of vaster temporality. And that in that thing, which in that moment, which a person I think would often dismiss as just so much reverie, right? And therefore irresponsibility and amnesia, absent-mindedness, you could call it. Like I say, no, I don't agree with that at all. I think in those moments of being outside time, one becomes aware of a kind of time. You can't make it happen. You can't predict it. You can't schedule it. You can't put it in your syllabus. But do I think that we all have the power to have these moments of realization? I do. And, you know, time suspended in this sense becomes, for me at least, a little different from time frozen. And this is, of course, just my take on things, but I would say, coming back to two of the photographs that Angela shared with us yesterday, I do think of the photograph on the left as being about frozen time, the stillness of the figures. Of course, the photograph itself often, you know, is going to like get into a kind of death grip with frozen time anyway, no matter what it depicts. But here, the frozen figures, the kind of apocalyptic or, warlike feeling of destruction in the scene at large, just suggests, in a very queer way, as I think was suggested, time is alienated, broken, fragmented, and we're caught, stuck on this moonscape, right? But to me, that's very different from this notion of time, which is, as I've tried to suggest, a kind of suspenseful time. I thought in this photograph here, it's maybe a little more complicated, at least in my way of thinking. There's a way that I could see this photograph being kind of a mix of frozen and suspended time. Frozen in the senses I've already described, but there's something kind of suspended in the sort of frayed, fretted edge of the shadowed hillside. And for me, in its synonymousness with the sort of lip of surf, and, you know, something about the dispensation of figures, even leaving aside the nice, interesting coincidence of the woman with Margaret French with the parasol and Edna with the parasol. This picture feels to me temporally more complicated, but nonetheless, I would say I'm not able to like enter into this and sort of find one of these places, let's call them, these orientations that are kind of disorientations, wherein I can experience the past, wherein, to a scrupulously materialist and political consciousness, I can be seen to be absent-minded, but in my heart of hearts, I'm feeling like I'm at the place. I've just gone down the rabbit hole, and I'm finally in the place where I can experience something that is not me. And I want to say something about this just in my final few minutes here about, give this a more personal dimension. You might say, well, gee, everything's been personal, and I agree with that. But I guess I do feel it's important, given what I've said, to try to demonstrate what I've been talking about, at least with my own example, that's not to do with Lorient or the Second World War exactly. But so this example comes to mind. So January 4th, 2019, I'm in St. Louis, which, as I've said, is where I grew up. And I'm there visiting my brother, but also because an old friend of mine from high school, who I always really kind of idolized, wrote to me after 40 years since we graduated and just mentioned that, well, her mother had died and she is coming back from London, where she lives, to St. Louis for the service. And, you know, if I'm going to be there for the holidays, would, you know, could we maybe see each other? And it was just a wonderful experience, and having to do with one's own memory and history and so on. But in any case, the thing that we did is we took a long walk in Forest Park, which is like the Central Park of St. Louis. And I was thinking about that walk for this talk, and I thought that the only picture I took that day, you know, admittedly just a humble cell phone photograph, but the only thing on our whole walk I thought to photograph on that winter day in St. Louis was this scene, which is just inverted trees in a pond, and in the kind of viscous, like almost icy water, right? And I just, in my way of thinking, I would say this is a moment of reverie in which history is encapsulated. You know, I'm thinking about this as a picture that is not allegorical of my sense of my relation to St. Louis and to historical time more broadly, but is somehow mysterious and unfathomable, both superficial and deep, inverted and right side up, like a complete picture in a way, but in a way that can't be described. And I was thinking about that in terms of the critique of this kind of consciousness, and just thinking, wow, you know, a photograph I know well is this photograph of this all white crowd of, that is, you know, completely segregated crowd of 500,000 people ultimately flocking a place in Forest Park to watch Charles Lindbergh's triumphant flight over the city a month after his transatlantic flight. So Charles Lindbergh, who's, you know, went on to become quite the Nazi sympathizer, and whose flight, for all of its extraordinary bravery and technical skill, you know, is part of a history of white supremacy in this country. And, you know, up here is the Art Museum, where Angela Miller and I think, even met, and where, just like Angela, I've spent so many hours, and it's really the formative place in my art history, historical life. Did I take AP art history as a high school student? Yes, I did. And just thinking, like, it's very hard to get from this to this without it seeming like just bourgeois reverie of exactly the kind that Benjamin and Adorno criticize. And I get that, like, I get that. And yet, how is historical consciousness still possible in this seemingly apolitical kind of personal reflection? And I was thinking about this in the context of our conference, and just thinking about something I'm really into, which is the diaspora of aviation wrecks around the world from the Second World War. And I guess into, in the sense that they seem to be places often where, you know, that is where these wrecks are recovered, to be places where the past is kind of ongoing in a very private, meditative way. And I was thinking about this one P-38 that is intermittently appears somewhat like Smithson's spiral jetty off the coast of Wales, depending upon conditions, but became very apparent in 2014 during a series of storms that ravaged the Welsh coastline. And, you know, I'm thinking about the particular kind of time that is embodied in these wrecks, these ruins, And I was thinking of Ellery's paper yesterday about the pinup art, because of course, famously, many of the GIs and, or many of the aviators and their aircrew painted these pinups on the noses of their airplanes, like on this P-38, which is called Wishful Thinking. It's not the P-38 that crashed in 1942 in off the coast of Wales, but nonetheless. And I was thinking, for purposes of time, that this here is just totally, if you like, dated. I mean, in a million ways we could talk about it. It's sort of an interesting part of a merely illustrational past. But once that pinup fades to nothing and becomes part of this, then it lives. Once it is an echo, then it lives. Once it is disembodied, then it lives. And it needs but the dreamer to, or I guess the fellow echo, to be able to come into being in its invisibility, in its submersion as the real thing, as the past. And I think between these two meditative souls, in one sense, there's a world of difference, which is, of course, that between, as I've said, the dreamer and then the literally like the archaeologist, like you could say really the historian, right? It's just the two worlds don't meet, but to me, they're so related, inseparable, and to say it again, it's when we dream and when we encounter something that isn't there, that we ourselves become, in a way, not there. And by virtue of that, experience temporality in a more extravagant and ambitious and like wounding way than historical periodicity and empiricism could ever deliver. And I think there's finally a kind of creative power to this, which is to me so much a part of being a historian, which is to say that by virtue of these experiences, these sensations, these wounds, gaps, and openings in time, I would say something like that pond in Forest Park becomes saturated, becomes impregnated with other things, and that, for example, this P-38 is there in that pond, where? In my mind, and although there's really no quote unquote defense for sort of saying, well, no, it really is in my mind, and here's why. Like, I've spent probably too long kind of getting into that argumentative posture with people. As a gent said in 2005 at the Victoria and Albert, I've never forgotten, this was after I gave a talk there, he said, first question out of the box, he says, I've been listening with I've been listening with increasing incredulity, ... And so, my mistake has always been like, well, wait a minute, So my point is, and then trying to rebut whatever it was he said. So I think my point is here, there's no kind of arguing this. It's just a feeling. And I present this in the sense that I hope others have had this feeling too, that is, the places that matter, like the personal pools that seem narcissistic, seem merely to be self-absorbed, are really the pools of echo. And we are the people of echo. Thank you.